ones that we know that at a regulator level, a national level, that people are struggling with, and we want to make sure we create these best practice techniques there, and everyone's in this, in the right space for that there today. So just a way to start us off, Damien, I'll get you to launch that first poll of ours, which is just to work out where people are coming from today. Ultimately, it's just a chance for us to work out who we've got on the line with, whether we've got trainers and assessors, compliance managers, consultants, RTO managers or owners or other, and that will help me to pitch some of the advice as we go through our webinar today. So if you could just sort of launch that poll now, that would be great, Damien.
Yes, Mark, the votes are starting to come in, which is great. 67% have voted so far. Just want to say a quick welcome to Veronica and Greg and Elizabeth and everyone who's joined us in the last couple of minutes. And we're at a stage where I'm about to show the results, Mark.
Okay, no worries.
Talk us through, Mr. Ratcliffe.
I might ask you to just talk us through very quickly there, Damien. Sorry, I just had a connection challenge for just a moment there. So if you could just tell us what the results were, and then I'll continue on with my slides.
Without any hesitation, we've got joint winners today. We've got 33% who are trainers and assessors, and 33% in other. That seems like a very high level of other to me. So what I'd love you to do, if you're in the other category, just pop it in the chat and let us know what you are. I'm guessing that maybe some of you are students, but please let us know what that other role is for you. We've got 11%. I've got a tie right across the board for the other three: compliance managers, consultants, and RTO managers or owners. So quite a few trainers and assessors in the room, and quite a few other. And I'm going to have a guess that maybe there's some students. In fact, one of the participants has just sent me a private message to say that they are a student. So that indeed might be the answer.
And this particular subject today, it does work quite well with our diploma of vocational education and training, as well as our diploma of design and development, and learning design and development, because we talk about the creation and development of assessment tools. So I think we've got a few people joining us who have done some of that or in the process of doing one of those from Melbourne there with Jeff. So it's great to have you on the line today and participating as we go through. So I've got all my connectivity back again now, Damien. It was sort of a strange drop out for a moment there, but I'm all back, which is great. So if I can get you back to my slides now, Damien, that would be awesome.
Yes, Mark, they're on the way. There seems to be quite a significant delay between my actions and when you're seeing it there today. But it should pop up there in a few minutes. And I believe you're going to be talking about how we're going to rate our assessment tools at the moment. That's an interesting topic.
Yeah, ultimately I wanted to start off with an idea of how you would rate your assessment tools right now. So based on those who are with us, there's some of us are in that RTO environment, some of us are studying to work in an RTO environment, so ultimately you can only really base this decision on what you've seen and been exposed to. But ultimately, I just want you to get a chance to think about how you'd rate this right now. So what I've got there is one of those bangers, a bit like when you would go to a fair and you try to be the strongman competition and hit that, so you can hit the bell. If you hit the bell, that would be a 10. Of course, if you can't even pick up the hammer, that would be a 0. And then there's every other response in between there. If you want to use the chat window to kind of grade yourself just broadly about the types of assessments that you're presently using now, how good are they? And how functional do you think they are in capturing the right kind of evidence for your candidate? So just spend a few moments just voting based on what you think is presently happening.
I see that we've got some results starting to float in already, Mark. I see that Catherine's rating is a 6. Now, I'm guessing that's on a scale of 1 to 10 as opposed to 1 to 6, Catherine, and that's fine. Veronica says that she's a student, and LLN is one of the challenges that she has to work through. Jeff Tate, the room consensus is a 5 from the 3 students who are with Jeff today. And Kathy says some are very good, others may not be the most suitable tool we could be using, so certainly sounds like some level of improvement. Phil's an 8, and Sophie's a 7. So
okay.
Looks like there's a bit of room for improvement.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense, Damien, there. So I guess that's the reason why you're on the line today, and as I said, I really hope to be able to give you a few more tips and tricks to not only create meaningful assessment tools, but to make sure that they're compliant and not in the ire of the regulator. So if we have a look at our agenda today, team, we're going to start off by giving ourselves some direction. So we'll talk about what I call is true north. So finding our true north which is getting the direction for our assessment. Then we'll share some definitions. Now, the idea of the definitions here is so that we're all on the same page, making sure that we're all defining things in the same way. For those of us that have been in the training and assessment game for a while, we know that we have some slippages sometimes in terms of what certain things mean. One of the examples I'll share later is the difference between an assessment tool and an assessment instrument. Years ago, these used to be synonyms for each other, but they mean very different things today. So again, we'll have a chance to consider what those things are for us. We'll look at the rules of evidence as well as the technical principles of assessment moving forward too. So these are the rules, if you like, that kind of govern us as someone developing assessment. And I want to give you some practical tips that you can put these things in action. They're not just stuff we do in our Cert 4 and our diplomas to say, make sure your assessment tools do this. I want to give you specific things that you can do to make sure that you are reflecting those principles of assessment and the rules of evidence in actual practice there. And then we'll finish up looking at 3 steps to developing the assessment tool, and this is ultimately dragged directly from the regulator's fact sheet, so I'm not steering too far away from the righteous path there. So first things first, we'll look at this idea of true north, and in true Mark Ratcliffe style, my north stands for 5 things. There'll be 5 things to give us direction when we're putting our assessment together. So the first thing when we come to this, folks, is when I do this in a classroom environment, for those of you that might want to reuse this as an activity, I actually get people to stand up and point in the direction of north. Tell me which direction they think it is, which is kind of interesting when they're in a room that doesn't have any deliberate directions, that they can't necessarily find their bearings. So from this perspective, team, you know, I asked them to stand in the direction, then I used my iPhone to get the actual direction moving for us there. And then in the end, it's really funny to watch because people are standing in lots of different directions. But ultimately, we want everybody involved with the assessment in our organisation moving in the same or the right direction. So we want everybody involved in the right direction. And that's what today's webinar is all about, making sure they're all in that right direction. So we'll start off with our true north being the N for north, which stands for nail the evidence. So the N of north is nail, and we want to make sure that we nail the evidence, because in the end, the evidence will protect our decision. So if we don't have quality evidence, we can't really support the claim for competency. So we have to be absolutely certain that we're capturing the right stuff in the first place. Just a quick aside, Damien, if I can grab you quickly, can I just confirm with you that you can see someone with a hammer in their hand on your screen?
Yeah, your slides are coming up very nicely and quite quickly, Mark.
Okay, that's good to know. But for some reason, my other screen is not working properly today, so I'm going to have to guess what you're seeing is what you should be seeing. I don't know what the problem is, but I've got time to troubleshoot it right away. So we'll move on. But as I said, I can't see what you're seeing now, so you might need to stop me from time to time if I'm talking to something that the audience can't see there. So keep me on my toes with that, please, Damien.
I'll look after you, I promise.
Appreciate it. So the first one is nail the audience. Nail the evidence, not nail the audience. That would be bad to do. The second part of north is to organise yourself. So as trainers and assessors, we know that planning is critical. It's paramount to everything that we do. We have to make sure that we're organising our efforts when it comes to the assessment. So what I mean by this is that if you need extra resources or things photocopied, or there's specialist equipment that the candidates need to perform their tasks, that we've organised that, we've got the access, and we've got the time to do it, rather than rocking up and thinking, okay, well, let's just start the assessment, and not have all the checklists that we need and the copies that the students need for themselves as well. The next key point here in our true north is being realistic about what they can capture. So the R this time is realistic. So what I mean here is that sometimes as organisations, RTOs and assessors, we try to create an all-seeing, all-knowing assessment tool which in the end doesn't necessarily meet everyone's requirement. So what I'm suggesting here is let's break it down into bite-sized chunks and let's be realistic about what we can capture in that moment, and look for different touch points in that candidate's journey towards competency. So rather than just doing the final assessment at the end, we've got lots of different opportunities to capture evidence along the way, and in the end, we've got quite a lot of evidence that supports their claim for competency. I remember some years ago when we used to be involved with a childcare centre, and we had the childcare assessors come out to look at our trainees, and they might spend a couple of hours there, but they were trying to sign off everything that they had to do in that qualification, which just really wasn't realistic. That, you know, it's okay to have a checklist and an observation checklist, but in the end, it's unlikely that they're going to be able to see them do every single thing that's required in that unit of competency. So you might focus on one area of that, and in this particular case, it might be something like doing programming for their students, or maybe how they interact with the children, or how they keep confidentiality with parents and so forth. But you're breaking it down into those bite-sized chunks, as I'm saying. The second last part of True North is about trialling, reviewing, and refining. Now, I can't say enough about this. We should always trial it before we take it out to full paying end users, just to make sure that everything's working correctly. It's a bit like we say to our trainers, just test all the equipment first before you go out and use it. It's the same thing with assessment. You know, we don't really know what's working, what isn't working until we trial. And from my perspective, the major benefit of a trial is to make sure that the instructions make sense to our candidates. So it may be perfectly obvious to us, but we already know the answer. So if somebody else reads that who's a candidate and they're confused by it, they may not give us the right evidence, not because they don't know it or can't do it, but they're confused by the instruction. And as we often say in our classes, those instructions can become destructions if they're not, you know, framed in the right kind of way. And the final part of our magical mystery tour that we call True North is have great systems for recording and reporting. So this time the H is for have. Have great systems for recording and reporting. Our job's not done until we've said, yes, we've confirmed the competency, here's the paperwork, it's in the right file, the feedback's to the candidate, and then we've fed back any other improvements to the system as we go through as well. So as I said, a lot of organisations have wonderful trainers and assessors, but they lack that devil in the detail. And one of my favourite quotes from Jim Collins, who's the guy behind Good to Great and Built to Last, these kind of big publications, he says that if you put a good person in a bad system, the system will win every time. So in the end, we're going to look to those really user-friendly systems that people understand what they need to do, and they can give you the quality data to inform practice and provide feedback to candidates so they can feed that into their own future performance as well. So I've given you some direction at this stage, folks. Here's your chance to give me some of your biggest challenges when it comes to planning, conducting, and reviewing assessment. Just take a few moments now to collect your thoughts and pop some ideas in the chat window about what you think is the hard part about doing this job. You know, planning, assessing, and conducting and reviewing that assessment. So a few moments, collect your thoughts, pop them in the chat window.
Mark, while everyone's getting their thoughts together, I might pop in a couple of thoughts on my own, if that sounds good.
That sounds good.
Look, I think one of the interesting things that always amuses me is conducting assessments and reviewing them, especially the marking side of things, because the marking can be the easiest thing to do in some senses, because you've got peace and quiet, you've got time, you can sit by yourself in many cases. In many cases you don't have to be rushed, in some you do, but it seems intuitively very, very easy. You know what the right answers are, you're ticking the boxes, you're checking things, you're looking to confirm competency, but at the same time it can be the most challenging things. I find that sometimes it's the marking. It can be so difficult, especially if it's an RPL type situation where you've really got to understand your competency really well to be able to make that judgment with confidence. And it's a confidence game, isn't it?
Yeah, and definitely I'll talk about the idea of the marking guide later, so that we're trying to break it down to the lowest common denominator invariably, so that you might have some really experienced assessors that are looking for a much higher standard than the standard that's required by that unit. So being really clear about how many examples the students have to provide, the ideal answers there are, the alternatives that could be done if there's more than one right answer, so to speak, is definitely going to make it a lot easier for you to get consistency in that assessment space. I'm just going to take a couple of pointers from the chat window now. Jeff and his team are saying when you're not the subject matter expert, that can be a little bit challenging because here you are being asked to assess, but there might be some gap areas in your own space. So again, that marking guide will definitely help you out there, Jeff, because it gives you some support about what good answers or good practice looks like, so then you know what you're looking for as opposed to being a little bit blind in doing that assessment stuff there. Sophie adds, ensuring that the assessments are interesting for the students and then the performance criteria aren't boring. So in this particular case, you can do that by giving them some choice of different case studies to focus on, involving them in thinking, where does this work in your own environment or from your own experience? Let's think about how this particular structure works there and so on and so forth. So definitely, Sophie, you've got some great ideas there. You've got to engage them there, otherwise they're just ticking and flicking stuff and it's not authentic. Catherine goes on to say, you don't necessarily get the opportunity to do them much in real life. So trying to give them something as authentic as you can is going to be there. So even if you're able to get some videos of real life and show them where it's implemented or applied, they can kind of get an idea of where this works in reality. Another key point here from Kathy is getting the actual assessors and the facilitators to engage with the review of assessments. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. We don't write the assignment, write the assessment and say it is perfect, there is no changes required, let's put it behind the glass and put the gold trim now because this is never going to get any better. Of course, it's only our best idea until new information presents itself, and you've got to review that, and then you make the tweaks. Sometimes those tweaks are quite large, sometimes they're font size and rewording and maybe adding an extra case study to broaden the choice there. So some really great ideas there as well. And just to finish up there, I think Jeff suggested here, meeting production requirements, the timing is always a challenge for us in this space. And one of my colleagues over in a mine site in West Africa said once to me that in this game, we are not time poor, we're time destitute. We're always chasing our tails to try to find more time to get the paperwork done, to create the authenticity, but in the end, produce fully functional people that are comfortable and confident to get out there and do the task that they have to do. So there's a whole range of ideas there, folks. I know there's extra ones that you said. Thanks for your contributions. We'll keep them moving as we go through our webinar today. So we are on this journey, and I've got a way of explaining, I guess, the seas in which we sail when it comes to developing assessment tools. So imagine the analogy here where you've got the ship, and the ship wants to sail, and we want to get to the right destination in the end. But some of those seas can be a little bit rocky. And within those seas, we have to take into consideration the current. And the current that we've got there are the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence. The principles of assessment relate to how we create the assessment. Are we asking for the right evidence to be produced? Are we asking the right questions, essentially? And then the rules of evidence relates to what the student actually hands back to us or completes for our observation. So it relates to what they're doing. So in really basic terms, the principles are saying, are we asking the right questions? And the rules of evidence are asking, did we get the right answers? Or did we get evidence that supports that claim for competency? So they're the waters we have to play, and I'll give you some tips and tricks today of how to put that into action. But if we drill down on that one and we look at the new streamlined training packages, the things that have the greatest impact on the training and assessment tools here are the elements and performance criteria, the performance evidence, the knowledge evidence, and then of course the assessment conditions. So these are like the sails. If one of these sails is not quite right, then we're going to be very slowly moving through the waters. We need all of these sails at full full stream, as it were, and in the end get the air behind them, get the wind behind them for us to get to our destination safely and on time. Now, of course, if you're not using the streamlined training packages, I know there'll be some people that are with us today that are still using some of the older ones. The terminology is slightly different, but I've got them on our sailing ship just the same. So rather than the knowledge performance and so forth, you've got required skills and required knowledge, and rather than assessment conditions, it calls it the assessment context. These are still the key things that have the greatest impact on us developing quality assessment tools. So let's drill a bit deeper now and think about what is meant by the term assessment. And I've got a quick definition that'll pop up on your screen in just a sec. Hopefully you're seeing that one now, Damien. Should see a happy guy at the bottom of the screen that's talking about assessment there. Is that something that you're saying?
I am seeing it, Mark. The guy with the hair.
The guy with the fro. Go the fro. Go the fro. And he's saying here that assessment's the process of collecting evidence and making the judgment on whether competency has been achieved. And again, that's our holy grail. In the end, we want to prove that somebody can do what they should be able to do, or they know what they should be able to know as a result of our time together. So if we drill that down a bit further, the role of the assessment instrument is to kind of get the documentation. So this is the documentation developed by the assessor to capture the evidence. It includes a whole bunch of things. So it could include things like templates, the observation checklist, might be the specific questions that you're asking, or indeed under a recognition for prior learning assessment, there might be a portfolio that they're putting together as well. So when it comes to the idea of the instrument, this is only the thing that we use to capture the proof of competency. Whereas the assessment tool combines that instrument but includes the instructions for the, it says learners on your screen, but it should say learners. So instructions for the learners and assessors. That's kind of funny as an editor there. So I must have looked at this a million times, and I've just noticed it as it's looking at me at 28-point font now. But not learners, but learners and assessors. So an assessment tool will want to give you some description of the context and the conditions. You'll want to know the tasks that need to be administered and maybe what order you expect those tasks to come into. And if they don't have to be done in that order, you can also talk about the flexibility that could be involved in giving this to a particular candidate. You want an outline of the evidence to be completed by the candidate, and in the end, the evidence criteria that you're going to use to judge that performance. So in years gone by, as I said earlier during the introduction, the assessment tool and assessment instrument were kind of seen as the same thing. Now, at a national level, we've defined them in this way. The instrument is merely the thing that captures the evidence, and the tool has that extra information, the instructions around context and evidence criteria for us to make those consistent decisions. So how are these definitions helpful when planning assessment tools? Just pop your best ideas in the chat window. Why do we need to know what assessment is, what an assessment instrument is, and of course what the big tool is all about?
So ladies and gentlemen, if you pop those answers in the chat, that'd be very, very helpful. Mark would have seen your question, Greg. I'm thinking that Mark will get to your question in a moment.
Yeah, I see that one there, Mark. See that one there. So Greg's asked here, or what does competent look like? Definitely. So in the assessment tool, you're trying to give your assessor the best idea of what a correct answer looks like or what competent practice looks like so that they can make an informed decision. And it's an organic thing, Greg, because ultimately, as you see an alternative way of doing it, you go, well, you know what, that does meet the criteria. It wasn't listed in the marking guide, it wasn't listed in the instructions, but it's still a right answer. It's in the spirit of the unit and certainly meets all the requirements of the performance criteria. So that also could be part of the picture of competence. For me, it's a bit like the picture we're seeing there. It's a very deliberate reason I've got the guys with the jigsaw puzzle, because I actually find competency to be a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. One or two pieces is not enough to see the big picture, but as you start to put more pieces, you start to see that full picture of competency. And for those of you on the line today that love doing things like jigsaw puzzles, often people start on the outside first. They get the frame first, and for me, that's a nice analogy with what we're trying to do here. The assessment tool also helps us to frame their competency and make sure we see that full picture of what they should be able to do. So hopefully that kind of answers the question for you, Greg. So back to this question in asking, why these are kind of helpful. Veronica says they provide the necessary framework for developing the tools to start off with. So I totally agree. And Catherine adds, you know, it helps you to get a checklist of the factors to consider when creating the assessment tool, and really make sure that the instrument meets the principles and the rule requirements. Jeff and Jeff Group in Melbourne is suggesting here that understanding the definitions allows you to focus on the plan of the tools. And Greg adds, delivering consistency and structure and having those measurable outcomes. So listen, I'm a big fan of all of your responses there. Give yourselves the proverbial pats on the back. So again, rather than move on with too much Swift, I did want to make sure that we were all over what the standards for RTOs have to say when it comes to these sorts of things. And I'm not going to read the whole lot there. You've got it on the screen there. I'll just take the key points from it. But Clause 1.8 for the standards of RTOs 2015 really make sure that we have a robust system, and we have to comply with the assessment requirements in the training package or the relevant accredited course. Ultimately, and this is where we're going to go next, we have to make sure that this assessment is in accordance with the rules of evidence and those principles of assessment. So this is where we're going to spend a little bit more time now, just to give you some things you can do to make sure you're complying in those two key areas. So the first one I want to share with you is some ideas around the principles of assessment. And you can see now that you've got the shiny red Ferrari that's there. And we've got a way of remembering this when we teach this in the class that I wanted to share with you today. So VFRF relate to the 4 principles of assessment. We say, you know, very fast red Ferrari is your way to remember it. But we refer in this case to validity, flexibility, reliability, and fairness. So if you've got those 4 things under control, you are meeting the principles of assessment. So when you're developing your assessment tools, you have to keep that in the back of the mind. You know, are we creating assessments that are valid, are flexible, that are reliable, and finally are fair, give everyone the best chance of success? So let's drill down a little bit on these things. So when we talk validity, this really suggests that any assessment decisions from the RTO are justified. You know, what we're doing is collecting, we're asking valid questions, or the tasks that we have our candidates do are relevant to the standard that we're trying to prove. Okay, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So in terms of putting some of this validity into action, I've got a few ideas to help you along your way. The first one is creating some mapping documents that show the relationships between the assessments and their relevant standards. Now these days, most people produce this at a higher level in their RTOs. So if you're a compliance manager or something like that, then you'll be all over this as a technique, and certainly an auditor will be looking for this. For those that aren't necessarily at that level in their RTO, it's just a nice best practice to really understand the relationship between what the standard is and how that manifests itself in the assessment instruments and ultimately the assessment tool that we use to capture the proof of competency. You might use things like observation checklists so that they can support both the capture of practical application, but also support the candidate along the way, knowing what sorts of things have to be in their performance. So what I like about observation checklists is that it's great for the student because they know what needs to be in their performance, and great for the assessor because they know what they're looking for. Okay, and my advice today is make sure the checklist kind of has things in the order that you would normally see it. So if you were doing something on customer service, what is the normal way of looking at somebody's interaction with customers? Is there a meet and greet? Is there some non-verbal communication? Is there a specific company policy on what you would say to a customer when you first see them? Is there some other interaction there that happens? So in the end, you think about what would you be seeing first. It just makes it easier to capture that evidence as you go through. And then in the end, you might have some marking guides that direct assessors to ensure learners' performance aligns to the standards. And Damien talked a bit about this before, making sure that you've got good marking guides that help us to find the right stuff. The next key part is flexibility, and I'm sure that everyone that's joining me today can do something similar to this one. Now, I'm sure you're all this flexible. Well, I'm not, but I'm sure the rest of us on the line are today. But when we think about flexibility, it's about assessing competency no matter how or where it's acquired. So it doesn't necessarily have to be done in a linear fashion. It can be done retrospectively with RPL. It could be done in different bursts. You might do it in a blended way, so sometimes it's assessed through previous experience and then you've done some gap training. Sometimes it's done in a completely simulated environment or a classroom situation. So again, it doesn't matter where or when it's been acquired as long as we can prove that it meets the right standards. In the end, it has to be appropriate to the context, I should say, the unit being assessed and also the learner's individual needs. So don't be afraid to be flexible in finding a different way to capture the same proof as long as you're always looking for the same outcome from them. So an example of this often we talk about in the classroom is if it's a knowledge-based assessment, it could be done as a written test, but it could also be done as a competency conversation or an oral test. You're still asking the same question, but you're capturing it in a slightly different way. So some tips in putting flexibility into action: provide choices. Okay, give them lots of different ways to submit their proof of competency. So in my example here, you might be asking them to create a data report, and this could be submitted as a written report, an infographic, a PowerPoint presentation, plus many, many other things. You might use a structured logbook or a portfolio so that people can start to add to their own portfolio over time. What's good about this is people, if they work for more than one organisation, they can capture that evidence over a period of time in more than one space. It doesn't necessarily die if they move on to a different group. So a quick tip here that you might be able to explore post-webinar is to add video links which explain what good practice looks like, or the types of evidence that's required. So this is for situations where you don't have the assessor with them. They might be preparing a portfolio. They might click on the link and say, these are the types of things you want to see in the portfolio. Well, here's an example of what other people have successfully put as part of their claim for competence. It could save everyone a lot of time. So let's take a few moments to think about this in the chat window. How else could we make our assessments flexible? Let's have a think. What could we do to make our assessments flexible? I'm not sure if Damien's got any ideas while we're waiting for some responses.
Look, I'm still trying to recover from that graphic of the girl doing the pose of a couple of minutes ago on your flexibility slide, Mark. I was trying to work out how that's even possible. But look, I think timing is a big factor. I know that's one of the things that surprised me when I came across from the university sector into the vet sector, was the fact that we don't have set times and everyone has to do this test and you must get it done in 30 minutes or it's bad news for you. We can change the duration that people have to do the assessment. We can change when it occurs. We can change, maybe break it up into multiple sections for people who might have concentration issues. There's lots of options and lots of flexible arrangements we can make just regarding time. And I'm guessing we're going to see some other options that aren't time related. I see that there's a good one from Phil that's already come in.
Is this the one about definitions, or is there something that's come in since then?
Actually, yeah, it's well, we can see one that's Greg. It's actually come up first. So Greg's talking about location. That's a good one, isn't it, Mark?
Definitely, you know, because from that perspective, you're giving people choice about where they can do the training or the assessment in this case. It doesn't always have to be done at the training site, and if they're already in the job, then it's even easier for them to capture authentic evidence whilst they're doing that job. So it's a great idea there from Greg.
Yes, Greg's a great solid contributor whenever we have these webinars. Look, he's agreeing with us with an absolutely already.
Which is great. So if you think of any other ideas as we go through, feel free to add that flexibility. But ultimately, it's a matter of just thinking a little bit more about it and say, well, what are some different ways that we can actually capture this evidence that's right for the candidate, but also good for us as an assessor too. Phil's just actually added, using different types of equipment too, and equipment that's relevant to their own situation. Rather than making them use equipment they would never normally use the equipment and use the terminology too within that organisation that makes them more comfortable in that workspace. So equipment, terminology, location, all of these things are great ideas when it comes to flexibility. And Sophie adds here, sometimes the more flexibility you give the students, the harder it is to be consistent, which is why that marking guide is so important, Sophie. So if you're giving giving variations, then you need to be very specific. If this is done in this way, these are the things that we're looking for. And when we're talking about things like reasonable adjustments, when does it become unreasonable? You know, so having that kind of clear guidance for your assessors will make a massive difference, and that way they can make a choice within the parameters that we know is still okay. So the next key point, folks, is about reliability, and the key thing this time is about consistency. We want to create consistent evidence regardless of where or when it's done, and we want comparable results irrespective of who the assessor is. So again, having those kind of documents that ensure that everybody's on the same page, everyone's singing from the same songbook, is going to be critical. Unfortunately, a lot of organisations give too much power to individual assessors to make a judgment call. So yeah, whatever you think, you're the expert. But in the end, having a lead assessor, having a marking guide to make sure that students aren't being over-assessed or under-assessed is going to be critical in not only complying but being fair around our assessment. So one of the things we talk about with reliability is using standardized testing. So if you're asking everyone the same questions, you know that's going to be reliable, you know. And you've still got some choices there to say, well, we could ask them as a competency conversation, or as a written test, or as part of a quiz, or through a webinar, as long as we're still asking the same questions and we can authenticate that the student knows it. Then all of those could be a reliable way of capturing the evidence. In terms of checklists, you can be using those to ensure that the learners are being asked to demonstrate the same things in different locations and by different assessors. So again, the devil's in the detail again, making sure that everyone's being asked to do the same things. And of course, once again, our marking guides come into play to create that consistency that we talked about. And we round up our 4 principles of assessment with fairness. And the image you'll see on the screen in a sec is really from the old Einstein joke that he said there, where he sort of says, you know, for a fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. So the goldfish and the elephant both have to climb the tree. You know, and what Einstein was saying there is that obviously the system's messed up because their needs are quite different. What do you really need them to prove? What's the point of climbing the tree? Is it about dexterity? Is it about increasing heart rate? Is it about the knowledge of the tree? If it's any of those 3, you can do that in lots of different ways that meet the requirements of that particular learner. So we have to focus on the learner's needs and then provide reasonable adjustments as appropriate, okay? And again, I mentioned before, you can have that guidance in the marking or assessor guide that says what is reasonable and, of course, what is not reasonable. So in terms of putting fairness into action, here are a few ideas. It's about providing equity, okay? Not necessarily giving everyone the same things, but enabling the same opportunity to succeed while removing the barriers that are not accessible. So if somebody has a vision impairment, it's not fair that they have to read, you know, small font. So you might make it 18-point or 22-point font. Now they can see it. I don't have to give every candidate 22-point font assessment tools. But in the end, only those that can't read it at a smaller level are disadvantaged, and that's why we bring the equity back into space. We can use reasonable adjustments, and this could include providing longer time to work, providing a scribe maybe to record responses, using the larger text, as I've just said, to enable easier navigation, or even using the basic English in written questions. So not being too over the top with the use of language there, so that it's clear and it's concise and people can understand it, particularly where English is not their first language. So there's a few different things that you can do there. And again, if that idea is in the marking guide, then people know just the parameters of how many changes they can make and still be within the spirit of the training package. So I've given you a few examples of reasonable adjustments. Can you think of any others? As always, feel free to pop your best ideas in the chat window. What other reasonable adjustments could be made in the conduct of your assessment?
Mark, I don't think I'll offer a specific reasonable adjustment, but what I do want to add here in the mix is that we have a specific discussion topic for our online students in the Certificate 4, and that discussion topic asks the assessors to and the trainees to provide us with a reasonable adjustment. They've either done in the past or seen in the past, depending upon whether they're an experienced assessor or not. And I just want to say that the amount of really, really interesting and creative responses we get fascinates me. So reasonable adjustment within our vet sector is certainly very much alive and well. Maybe not so much in the university sector, which is something that Catherine has alluded to.
Definitely,
but
yeah.
Within the vet sector, it's alive and well and working beautifully.
So again, there's a multiplicity of things you can do. I guess I'll go back to what I've said a couple of times already, Damien, is that what's reasonable and what's unreasonable. So an example of what would be unreasonable, if I say, well, listen, I need you to actually create a written task. That is the competency. So you have to prepare a report, and that's what the task is. That's what the element relates to. I can't have you use somebody else's because you have to develop it yourself. You can't do an artistic version of it, so you can't draw pictures of what the words are because the standard is a report. So there are some situations where, yes, it would be great to use all these other mechanisms, but if the performance criteria require them to do certain things, then we can't change those. But where it's not assessed, we can certainly throw some flexibility around the edges.
Look, I think that's a good point, Mark. I think that what the subtle message you're giving there is that whenever we're unsure about whether it's a reasonable adjustment or not, just go back to the standard, look what the competency standards tell us. That's your starting point for making that decision.
Definitely. And we've got a few other ideas in the chat window here, Damien. Kathy suggests that providing a scenario or a case study for a student when they're unable to demonstrate the skills for themselves to kind of put them into a context can be a good way of kind of getting them in the right direction as well. So if they don't have access to a practice site, providing one for them is going to be a reasonable adjustment there. And in most cases, the units of competency will suggest that in the absence of a real setting, a practice site that faithfully represents what they need to be able to do is an okay alternative. And of course, I'm paraphrasing, but that's the sort of thing that it looks at. Jeff says using alternative locations could be also a nice way to be a reasonable adjustment. So it could be done at home, at the community centre, at the church, at the coffee club, whatever it might be. There's lots of different places where this could actually work there. And Sophie adds, students submit videos of assignments or assessments in their courses, and she's had students who have been very nervous and have anxiety in front of cameras, so they just adjusted the assessment for them conducting a phone interview instead, or a Skype call, which you could record instead, and you still have the evidence, Sophie, but in the end you've reduced that anxiety and they can perform at their best. And something I actually said to my conference guys today was that if we reduce tension, we actually increase retention. We get the best out of our people if they're not anxious. So some great contributions, folks. Thanks so much. So let's look at the other side of the coin. We've looked at the principles of assessment. Now let's have a quick squiz at the rules of evidence. And you see a vacuum cleaner on your screen. You're probably wondering what's all that about. Well, in this particular case, we've got 4 things to do with the rules of evidence. That spells VAX. So that's why I've got the vacuum cleaner there. So once again, we've got validity, we've got authenticity, we have currency and sufficiency. So we've got validity in both the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence, because we want to make sure that not only are we asking the right questions, but getting the right answers. So it has to be valid and relevant at both sides of the table. But in terms of the next things, you want to know that it's really their work. That's what authenticity means, that we've got a reflection of their current practice and there's enough of it for us to make a quality decision. So we start off with that validity question, and your question in the chat window is, how do we ensure that we have valid evidence? How do we know that it's relevant to the standard that we're trying to prove? What do we think? What's your best way of doing that, folks?
Greg, I noticed that you've just put your hand up there. Did you want to say something, Greg? Is that your intention? Just pop in the chat box and let us know.
Well, Greg just suggested it's current, so that we ensure it. But I think validity and currency do go hand in hand. So if we see them kind of do it, we know that it's really their work and all the rest, and we know that it's the latest thing happening. So that's one way of making sure that it's really consistent with what we're looking for. Not sure there's any other ideas. As always, I'll give you some ideas, and if Greg, you want to give an example, feel free, and Damien will bring your mic on.
So Greg's clarifying, I posted a question regarding any recordings you may do of a student. Oh, it's up a little bit higher. With a recording, Mark, would you be expected to support it with a transcript? Do you think that might be necessary?
Sometimes, not always though. It depends on what you're looking for in the end. If it's more about a diagnostic thing, then you're not going to necessarily need that transcript. If it's a final assessment, you might need to invest in some software that will record that transcript. And there's plenty of software that's out there that'll do that for you. Very clever stuff that's out there now. Even the platform we're on right now, it can determine who's talking at what time and actually separates that sound. So even something like GoToMeeting, where you share screens and show videos, can actually separate that, and you could extrapolate that out and get the transcript without having to do too much extra work. But it may be overkill, I guess, is the key thing. Sophie adds, you don't ask for the transcript, but you ask for a case study report or analysis, which might give you a summary of what's happened too, which I think is fine. Phil adds a matrix of the standards and the mapping documents. Absolutely, you see that relationship very well. So you can be confident that what you're seeing and you're making a decision on is the real deal. And John adds, if the assessment instrument is based on correct mapping of the training package requirements, then the instrument will collect the right evidence, evidence that's valid and certainly relevant to the learner's competency for that particular unit that they're actually being assessed upon. There's some great advice there too. So in the end, this is a really critical thing there. We could ask for a lot of evidence, but if we're not getting quality stuff, if we're not getting things that are relevant, then we can't make a decision on somebody's competence. Or in fact, we can only say not yet competent because the evidence we have doesn't take us far enough. And I get this a little bit when we do RPL applications. Sometimes people would give us everything they've ever done in the history of mankind, including, when they did a forklift ticket or when they won an award for writing a book when they're in primary school. I'm thinking, well, I'm proud of you for doing that. I'm not necessarily sure how that evidence impacts on your ability to be a trainer and assessor when they're applying for the Cert 4. But hey, listen, congratulations when you were 12 and you won a second prize in the book contest. That was great. So in terms of ways that we can ensure that valid evidence, marking guides are part of the picture. Assessment tools with link backs to the unit of competency is also helpful, so that everyone who's participating with it knows, where that relationship is. I think that works quite well. You might use rubrics, and I've got a link there on the screen if you want to create your own rubrics. RubyStar.4Teachers is the link that I'm suggesting there today. So is the one with the full URL on the screen there, but you can check that out. And ultimately, if you've never seen a rubric before, it's a way for you to help focus your feedback to them, identify this is what competent practice is. But if you're not quite there yet, this is the kind of thing that you would need to bring it back towards competency. And I've got a quick example of that that'll pop on over the screen. So in this particular example that you're seeing, there's 4 levels. You've got emerging, developing, proficient, and advanced. If we replaced proficient with competent on this particular picture, this is something that we could use, I think, quite well in our own assessment situation. So we're looking for proficient or competent, but if they were emerging or developing, our feedback would be a little different. But we know what we're looking for because the rubric's telling us if they've got this performance, we say these things. If they've got this performance, we give them this feedback. What I really like about this rubric is that we move past just competent. If someone's doing an outstanding job, really doing stuff well above what's required as the minimum level, it's nice to be able to give them, in this case, some feedback about how well they're doing and how relevant that might be for the workplace. The next one is authenticity. It's all about being real, and some ways that we can make it real and keep it real, as the kids say, is review drafts as part of the stages of the development. So rather than just waiting for the final report or the final assessment piece, let's see it at different touch points along the way. That way we can give them feedback, they can make some changes, but we also see the incremental improvements over time, and that helps us to authenticate the final response. We could use anti-plagiarism applications such as turnitin.com. A lot of RTOs are actually using this in Australia and make sure anything that's a written task is submitted to this, and it will actually tell the person before they submit, for real, how much of their work is considered plagiarized. So, you know, if it's upward of 70 or 80%, well, they know straight away that what they're submitting is not their own work. If it's a lower level type thing, around 20%, 25%, yes, certainly there are some things that you can't avoid, turns of phrase that you can't avoid. I think that's acceptable, and you might have an organisational policy where, you know, set 25 to 30% may be appropriate. Anything above that, we want them to resubmit. You might use photographs or videos of candidates performing the actual tasks and then upload that to a location for easy access and referral later, such as your client management system or a cloud-based system such as Dropbox or Evernote for easy access. You might have some of the work completed in the student's own handwriting. And over the years, we've had some really great feedback from auditors that have come to audit us as an RTO. They said that they really liked that we had students that were writing things in their own handwriting because they could see that they were really doing it. And then if there were some resubmissions, they can also see where we've provided the feedback and then they've submitted their second or third time. Again, it adds weight to the authenticity that they're really doing the work they're supposed to be doing. And the final one on this list is about competency conversations. So sometimes it's just easier to have a sit down, have a chat, or have a Skype call and pose a few scenarios and say, well, what would you do in this situation? And then they would show their applied knowledge by their responses in this case. As long as we've got a credible way of recording that or writing down what we heard or confirming that what they said was consistent with the requirements, then we're in good shape. So how else do we authenticate work out there in the big bad world? Or are you doing this? Let me know. Use the chat window, folks. How else do we authenticate our work? Obviously, seeing people do it is a good way of working it out. So a lot of organisations will still do things live while the participants are there. It means it's a controlled setting. You see them do it, which is good. Kathy suggests asking the students to sign some sort of a declaration. Whilst it doesn't mean that it's totally their own work, it does put pressure on them to say, well, listen, I'm signing off that this is my true and original work, and if it's not, they're doing it knowingly. So I think that's a good strategy there, Kathy. Jeff adds here maybe some third-party reports, so getting people out in the field that can attest to the fact that they're applying this stuff that's in the classroom in the workplace. So there's some great ideas there in terms of authentication. As we move along, the rules of evidence currency is next in our VAX. So we could use things like timestamps and videos, timestamps on videos or photos so that we know when that footage was taken. Even things like an Instagram feed will tell you when that was posted. So you can encourage people to take pictures of themselves doing the tasks on a closed Instagram group, and that would be a very authentic way of doing things. So like I said, use your social media for good rather than evil, rather than posting pictures of cappuccinos and then 30 seconds later, here's the cappuccino, but after a sip, you're actually getting them to show the different steps of them performing a particular task. It could be really great for learning as well as assessment. You might use some other situations here as it relates to some e-portfolios or e-files there, so that could work quite well. So you might use that as a way of identifying when they actually accessed it last and so forth. But if you open up a Word document, for instance, you will see how many times that document was edited, when it was printed, and so forth. So if somebody submits something to you on email and it says it was created in 3 minutes, was never edited and was never printed, it's likely they've cut and pasted it from a Google search and then submitted it, you know what I'm saying? It also means if their name's not on that file, it could be taken from somewhere else as well, and it makes it very easy to find the original source because you can look at the properties in that e-file there. And let's make sure that every instrument has a date so that you know when they were last assessed, so that you know what the gap in terms of a time frame has been since they were last asked to do that task. And the final part of this picture, team, is sufficiency. So one of the things that we talk about when we talk about this in class is the rule of 3. You know, often in the unit of competency, it doesn't specifically say how many times they have to do it. And again, in the absence of that, 3 is not a bad place to start. And then we talk about the idea of more than once in more than one way over a period of time. It starts to build that pattern of performance. And I'll hark back to that jigsaw puzzle thing. One or two pieces may not be enough, but as you start to put the pieces together, that full, picture of competency becomes available. Now we are very close to closing time there, folks, and I would have liked to have done the 30-second stretch break before now, but just feel that get the kinks out of the necks and so forth, and we'll come on home with fast and furious with the final key things as they relate to developing best practice assessment tools. So grab yourself a quick water, quick stretch break, and we'll be back in a sec.
I know that if I try to do that, there's going to be more than kinks that need to be ironed out, Mark. I suspect need some serious chiropractic adjustments over an extended period of time, I suspect. Mark, we're going well. Developing assessment tools. You going to tell us about the main steps?
I am, Damien. Ultimately here, this comes from the ASQA fact sheet now. So I've given you my practical implications of it. Now let's look at what the regulator has to say on the issue. When developing assessment tools, there are three main steps. The first step is planning. So we're asking ourselves, what are the assessment requirements of the training package or the accredited course? What does the feedback from industry look like? We know we have to engage with the industry to say what do they need, what are their unique situations, what are the forms and templates and equipment and terminology that they use. We need to get that information from them as part of the planning phase. And then what assessment methods are most appropriate for those learners? So again, these are some of the things that we need to check out. In terms of the design and development, this is step 2. So once we know the answers to those first things, we can start to ask us how does each of those components come together. So, the mapping, the instruments, the instructions, some of the ideas of reasonable adjustment and so forth, that's all part of the design and development. In the end, we're driving ourselves to this question, which is what documentation is needed to capture the evidence and ultimately make a good quality decision on competency. And the third step, and this is the one that goes often undone or underdone, which is the quality checks. I mentioned before trialing was super important, but checking to make sure that the things you think are working are actually working is going to be paramount to developing success when it comes to assessment tools. So how can a tool be reviewed prior to implementation? Making sure that we've got, a group of people that are representative of the client group going through it, just to make sure they understand what's required, that the instructions are clear, that there's enough time for them to complete the tasks or write their answers in a book if you're doing it that way. Doing that trialing first is going to be super important. So I might move past a couple of those quickly, folks, but in terms of some critical things I wanted to share with you super quick is when it comes to things like determining assessment methods, there are some things for us to consider. We'll need to think about the cohort. We'll want to think about who will collect the evidence. Is it you as the assessor? Are they doing it themselves as a candidate, as a part of a portfolio? Is it a third party that's collecting it? So again, your instructions will be different depending on who's collecting the evidence. Where will the assessment be conducted? Is it on the job, off the job, in a virtual space? And then when will it be conducted? So again, choosing the right tool for the right job in that situation will be critical to make sure that we've got that quality evidence. So some old friends here when it comes to assessment methods include things like the direct observation, you've got questioning, you've got simulation activities, third-party reports, and portfolios or review of products. So again, depending on which of these you use or a combination of these, they will need different templates and different instructions. So a quick poll, Damien, if you can launch this for me. Which of these methods do you use the most in your training? Is it the direct observation, questioning, simulations, third parties, or portfolios? Please feel free to launch that poll now, Damien.
The answers are starting to roll in, Mark. We've got 30% voted so far. Getting a little bit of a spread, but there are some definite favourites here, folks. Just give you a few more seconds, about to close that off and share the poll. These results I find particularly interesting, Mark. I think this will be a little bit eye-opening in that we're showing them now. There's a couple of categories here, a couple of methods that have scored no votes: simulation activities and third-party feedback. Portfolios, review of products has got 11%, but two big winners here, both on 44%. Direct observation and questioning. It would seem that with our group today, they like to get out there and see the evidence and alternatively ask questions to get that knowledge.
Okay, that's great. I mean, certainly it makes a lot of sense because you're combining the knowledge and the practice together with direct observation and questioning. But again, there's some other options in the toolkit that we'll want to think about. So we can launch us back to my slides there, Damien, and we'll bring it home with the idea of things that we can do just to make sure that we're getting everything that we're supposed to get with those quality checks. That's all about trialing, reviewing, and refining as we move forward. So can you see my screen again, Damien?
You're good to go, Mark.
Okay, good to know. Thank you. So to ensure that our assessment tools are consistent with the requirements of the training package and that they're maintaining their currency, sufficiency and effectiveness, it's important that we trial them, review them and refine them prior to use. So consultation with industry beforehand will help to confirm whether we've got the right content. So content accuracy is important, whether it's relevant to the workplace, and finally, whether the language we're using is appropriate. And again, that's why we want to connect with the industry to make sure that we've got a great transition, that our graduates are using the kind of terminology and the kind of equipment, the kind of experiences that faithfully represent the job. Okay, so again, trial that with people that know the job so that we're delivering the right kind of experience there. Again, we can review with our trainers and assessors to make sure that all the requirements are covered. Again, these are our experts in our pocket. They know what the training package is all about. Check with them to make sure we're covering everything. We can, enable the most effective collection of that evidence. So they're out there in the field, they're on the cold face there, what's working, what isn't working. It's good to connect with our trainers and assessors to find that out. And again, it helps us to clarify those instructions. Would they like more instructions? Would the candidates like more instructions? Is there quite a lot of variety in people's responses? How do we get more consistency around that? Again, speaking to our trainers and assessors will help. And the final part of the picture here, team, is trialing the tools beforehand will really help to test the effectiveness. And ultimately, what this will allow us to do is to find out whether it's cost effective, whether it's engaging for the learner, and in the end, whether it's likely to produce both valid and reliable evidence. If you're achieving these things, folks, then you're well on track to creating best practice assessment tools, not only for compliance, but also to give you functional tools you can take out to your assessors and get those consistent results. So as a quick closer, team, I know we've gone over time. We're in injury time now, I guess, as they would call it. But listen, if you can stay with us for just a few more moments, let's think about what we've done today in the webinar and what's something that you would choose from one of the tips that I've shared and maybe something you might lose from your own practice as a result of the discussion we've had today. And feel free to pop those ideas in the chat window. So choose or lose is your option today, folks.
Mark, just while our folks here start to think their way through their choose or lose, I might just highlight a question that Greg asked earlier that I promised him we'd get back to.
Sure.
Greg was asking about the degree of paperwork, the amount of paperwork with assessment. Is there some sort of formula to work out how much paperwork is required, what maybe the essentials of the paperwork are in terms of preparing assessment tools?
Listen, I'm right in the middle of this right now, Greg, and I don't have a great answer for you because we've been developing stuff for the new TAE 16, and I've got hundreds of pages of paperwork, But listen, what I will say is that what I've been really sobered by is by getting up close and personal and delving quite deep, it's helping me to create resources that I think will save us time as a company down the track, because I've gone crazy with the mapping. So I've got mapping documents not only for the assessment but also for the resources that show the relationship between where they study it and then where we capture the proof. And then we've got marking guides that help our assessors to say these are the ideal answers that we're looking for and these are some of the variations we'll accept. We've got mapping ideas that look at this is where that particular unit is covered and so forth. So even though there's a lot of work to it, I actually think it will save us time down the track. We'll get better at our assessment, we'll be quicker at our assessment, and we'll provide more robust feedback as a result of that. So, I'm happy to take it offline if you want to grab your details, Damien, from Greg, and I'm happy to provide some examples of some of those templates that I'm working with now that might take you to that holy grail. But ultimately, it is what it is. Our industry is a very much a paperwork-driven thing. But rather than just seeing it as ticking a box, let's try to create functional documents that make our lives better and create more robust outcomes for our participants. So hopefully that gives us some direction, but I'm not sure I'm letting you off the hook, Greg.
Greg, if you'd
So listen,
like
I've got
to
a few
access
great,
that.
yeah, feel free to take it offline. That'll be cool. But we've got some great ideas there in the chat window, folks, about things you can do next. So listen, I won't talk to all of them there, but a lot of them talk about, quality assurance and spell checking, as I should have done too, folks. Not leaners, but learners. But in the end, just trying to find things that will help us to make that overall experience better. So listen, folks, thanks so much for your time, and I appreciate you spending an extra 5 minutes with us as well. If you liked this sort of webinar, folks, you like our webinars, with another one coming up with which Damien is programmed for, which is dealing with those difficult participants coming on the 8th of December. And as always, you can check out our website at mrwed.edu. That's actually, that's another spelling mistake. I'm not going well today, Damien. That should say edu.au/webinars. So I need my spell checker on this one before we move forward next time. So I'm sacked as editor now from these things. But in any case, folks, you've been awesome. Thanks so much for taking part. If you've got any other questions, I'll hang around for a bit. Otherwise, feel free to have a great rest of your day. And for those joining Jeff in Melbourne, enjoy the rest of your diploma, and we'll see you next time.
Okay, folks, was there another question or two for Mark? Otherwise, we are done, and you're free to depart the building. We do appreciate your time here today. We're sorry we've run a little bit over time. I know that we try very hard to keep them right on track. Jeff, you've got a fan. Catherine from Penrith is saying hello to you in the chat. And, Jeff has already left the building, Catherine. I'll pass it on to him. I'll get that message to him. Yep. All right, I think we're good for questions, Mark. It looks like we are all done, friend.
Kathy's popped one in. Yep.
Kathy's just popped one in. Would an observation checklist be okay to use as evidence that a student has completed activities in class? I think I know the answer to that one. What do you think, Mark?
Well, certainly if the checklist covers the right level of detail, Kathy. I mean, in the end, if it just is quite broad and doesn't drill down on what those activities should have been, then maybe not. But generally speaking, I've certainly used them in the past as a yes, so I'd be on the yes side. It's a yes for me.
Yes from me. Sounds great. Yep. All right, guys, I think that's about it.
And thanks, Damien, for your help too. I appreciate it.
No worries, and thanks, Mark, for coming and sharing your wisdom today. Everyone have a great day. It's time to depart the building. We are done. Thank you very much for participating in today's webinar. There'll be a recording and an email coming out to you tomorrow. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.